that, you know, when you first told her about home birth, and she was like, well, you know, in the guidelines, I'll just make sure this microphone is off.
Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We will continue now after a short break, and we will continue with the next opening keynote of this opening morning of the Humanizing Childbirth Launching Critical Midwifery Studies Summer School. And we're very happy to have as the next speaker, Amrita Banerjee. I will quickly introduce Amrita, and then she'll start with her lecture. Amrita Banerjee is an associate professor of philosophy at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. She received her PhD in philosophy and the graduate certificate in women's and gender studies from the University of Oregon in the USA. Banerjee held the position of assistant professor of philosophy at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, USA, prior to joining IIT Bombay. She specializes in moral and socio-political philosophy, which she approaches from the perspectives of feminist philosophy, classical pragmatism, and 20th century continental philosophy. Banerjee focuses on marginalized intellectual spaces within philosophy, and especially work by women philosophers and philosophers of color within these traditions. Her papers have appeared in prestigious journals such as Hypatia, the Journal of Speculative Philosophy, The Pluralist, and Philosophy in the Contemporary World. She is the co-editor of the special issue titled Mothering from the Margins of Philosophy in the Contemporary World. And she has also been instrumental to the organization of this summer school. She will host together with Priya Sharma a webinar on the 4th day that is hosted by IIT Bombay. So we welcome very warmly Amrita Banerjee for this opening keynote. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rodante. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, let me thank the organizers of this summer school for inviting me for today's talk, and a special thanks for Rodante for the invitation. And I mean, you know, they have put a lot of effort in the summer school, and I'm sure it will benefit all the participants. So I'm going to begin my talk. I do have some slides prepared with the bullet points, and I'm going to sort of lecture side by side. So Rodante had asked me to speak on the broad theme of transnational feminism and reproductive justice. And so today I'm going to focus on transnational surrogacy in particular, on which I have been working for almost a decade now. And the focus of today's lecture is going to be the ethics of caring for birth givers in the context of third-party reproductive arrangements as commercial gestational surrogacy. And the theoretical focus will be on the concepts of vulnerability and reciprocity. I will develop a critical lens on the established liberal model of reciprocity in the debate on surrogacy, and its inability to sufficiently address the question of care for the surrogate. In contrast, I will lay out a philosophical model that I have developed called the feminist pragmatist approach, which is capable of conceptualizing reciprocity while factoring in vulnerability, unlike the liberal model. And all this is needed, I think, in order to ground an ethics of caregiving, which humanizes the birth giver and respects the work of birthing that she does. Now, when we talk about ethical and justice related considerations in the context of third-party reproduction, when these practices cross borders, there are a host of problems that come into the picture, particularly because on the global stage, birth work is carried out by surrogates in the middle of various global and localized patterns of inequalities. And the birth giver, the surrogate, often encounters dehumanization, exploitation, and violence in the process. I have, I think, circulated 3 papers for the session, and I will be focusing quite heavily on the feminist pragmatism paper, but I will be referring to the other 2 as well. And as I said, the feminist pragmatist approach is meant to evolve a context-sensitive ethical approach to transnational surrogacy, which is able to capture the moral harms, but at the same time is also able to capture agency of the surrogates in the process. so that she's not simply treated as a kind of passive victim. I'll talk about this in detail in the sections of the paper. And I have actually, when I started to work on surrogacy, the ethics of transnational surrogacy, largely the models of the moral models were developed in a Western context. And they were mostly sort of arguments that were either arguing for that surrogacy is a win-win situation, or arguing the other extreme, that it should be completely banned and prohibited, and it's morally wrong. So there was this kind of absolute right and wrong debate that that ethicists would engage in the context of the practice. And I think when we look at the practice, and especially in the transnational sphere, we need to have a much more context sensitive and nuanced approach, which are able to capture the injustices and the vulnerabilities, but also is able to preserve the agency of the surrogate. So with this in mind, and this is the kind of larger structure of the focus of the talk. And now surrogacy is, so one of the things that we need to keep in mind, that whenever we are talking about transnational feminist ethics, or ethics, any sort of ethical relation in the transnational context, and we want to ground claims of reproductive justice in the transnational sphere, it becomes an extremely difficult task, because we need to evolve productive definitions of concepts like reciprocity, vulnerability, exploitation, and agency in the transnational sphere. And we cannot really talk about something like reciprocity in simplistic terms, such as on the grounds of formal qualities as common humanity or commonality of oppression, in a world that is marked by unequal distribution, unequal access to resources, and conflict between different parties on different sides of privilege, right? So all these concepts need to be problematized and thickened. And as a philosopher, I'm really sort of interested in these sort of these concepts that harness that anchor this debate. Now, surrogacy, of course, is an arrangement where a woman called a surrogate bears a child with the help of technological intervention for somebody else. In India, the form of surrogacy practiced dominantly has been transnational, gestational, that is where the surrogate only gestates the baby but has no genetic connection to it, and commercial, where she is paid for the services. Due to the availability of well-qualified doctors and readily available labor, India became the surrogacy capital of the world, with a multi-million-dollar industry in the 2000s. However, one of the major factors in the expansion of the industry was the absence of any law to oversee it. The Indian Council of Medical Research had come up with guidelines in 2005, but these remained more or less non-binding. This led to further unregulated use of ARTs and surrogates, and where clients traveling from the first world, including people of color from the first world, chose India as their surrogacy destination, and the surrogates would be from India. Now, of course, such unregulated use led to a range of ethical and justice-related concerns for transnational surrogacy. Sort of in my work, which was the earlier sort of philosophical work on Indian surrogacy, this started when some attempt was being made to formulate a law around assisted reproductive technologies. However, the concerns that I pose with respect to the surrogacy contract and the philosophical framework I have developed can pertain to approaches or concerns about third-party reproduction, broadly speaking, even when the destination country is not India, but other destinations as well. Actually, now in India, the transnational component as well as the commercial component has been banned. Okay, so I move on to the first section of my talk. The talk is divided into three broad sections. So the first section, I kind of set up reproductive liberalism and its critique that I make. And in the second section, we come to the question of vulnerability, but how we also need to talk about agency and reciprocity while discussing vulnerability. And the third section focuses on the model. So when it comes to the ethics of surrogacy, for a long time, the dominant ethical argument in favor of surrogacy in the Western context was based on the notion of autonomy or choice. People in this camp, often understood as advocating a kind of reproductive liberalism, to use Janice Raymond's term from the book Women as Wombs, argued that the surrogate has the right to choose and make decisions about her own body and reproductive capacity. And commercial surrogacy often got represented and marketed in the language of autonomy and choice, right? That it is projected as creating new opportunities for the surrogate to exercise greater autonomy and agency than she could before. Now, in the context of a surrogacy contract, let us try to look at the idea of a contract a little bit. Now, a contract is an agreement between autonomous and freely consenting individuals who are parties to it. And the surrogacy contract is much like other kinds of contracts, like an employment contract. Now, the idea of a contract was developed as a philosophical concept and a normative theory by philosophers in the social contract tradition, such as Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant. And when we say normative theory in philosophy, we are talking about a critical standard that can serve as a conceptual blueprint for how free and just social and moral relations ought to be ordered. Moral relations include concerns of obligation and responsibility that we have towards each other. So it takes the question of what we owe to each other, while political relations are those between citizens as well as between what a state owes to its citizens. The social contract is often taken to be governed by a more fundamental moral contract, which considers all human beings to have equal worth and as having some basic obligations towards each other. The contract model as a philosophical framework values individual autonomy and choice, since a contract is not possible without the consent of those, that is, the parties that govern it. Therefore, the idea of choice is central to the notion of a contract. When it comes to the main idea of a social contract that has dominated the landscape of moral and political philosophy from mid-20th century onwards, it is John Rawls's understanding. In Rawls's philosophy, the socio-political sphere is conceived as a sphere of cooperative activity in which individual citizens in their capacity as self-interested agents compete for certain primary goods. These goods are primary as they are desirable to all human beings and include things such as rights and liberties, health, income, and the social basis of self-respect. The main concern from the point of view of justice is to stipulate terms of fair cooperation so that every individual as a party to the terms of cooperation shares equally in its benefits and burdens. In this context, equality and reciprocity as philosophical ideas become especially important. So just as choice is very fundamental to the idea of a contract, reciprocity and equality also become very important concepts. In Rawlsian schemes, symmetry between two parties to the contract become a defining feature of equality, since each party is taken to be situated equally in relation to other parties. When equality is defined as symmetry, then it entails reciprocity. Each party shares in the benefits and burdens of social cooperation, the contract that is, according to a common benchmark of comparison. No individual is typically morally entitled to more or less benefits or burdens based on the social location she inhabits at the time. Now, in my own work on transnational surrogacy, I have argued that although commercial surrogacy is a contractual relation between the surrogate and her client, the typical values of independence, autonomy, equality, and choice that are central to the normative idea of a contract, which reproductive liberalism highlights, for instance, right, when they are looking at the surrogacy contract. These ideas of independence, autonomy, equality, and choice fail to capture aspects of exploitation on the one hand in the context of the surrogacy contract, and fail to ground moral entitlements owed to the surrogate that respect her work of birthing. Of course, the language of choice, when evoked in the context of transnational surrogacy, may have limited value, since it has the potential to override the hegemonic depiction of third world women in the Western imaginary as immature, childlike, and thereby can situate them as active, rational, and morally mature agents. However, I think the chief disadvantage of using reproductive liberalism as the framework for ethical analysis is that it has the danger of normalizing power imbalances and the exploitation of the less powerful by the more powerful players of globalization. In other words, reading the third world surrogates experience as empowerment simply on the grounds of choice or decisional autonomy and romanticizing her subject status on the basis of this without going into the problematics of consent leaves out any scope for addressing the oppressive socio-political conditions in which she takes up this identity and exercises her agency. In other words, if the surrogate status as a subject is romanticized, then theoretically it becomes difficult to talk about the larger social world she inhabits with its constraints of poverty, social ostracism, lack of access to certain basic necessities, and so on. If we are not able to capture these aspects, then local and global vulnerabilities will be accentuated for the birth giver, thus rendering the already precarious work of birth giving across borders more exploitative. Further, reproductive liberalism as an ethical paradigm fails to do justice to the voices of those surrogates who both experience and define their work in terms of their unfortunate situation. And Amrita Pandey, who's an ethnographer, talks about this in terms of majburi or compulsion, that they really don't, some of them don't experience the work as choice, but rather as a kind of compulsion. So reproductive liberalism fails to analytically capture this experience and also to talk about the moral harm in the context of the experience. There is also a serious lack of reciprocity. We have defined reciprocity as equality-based symmetry, right? And there is really a serious lack of reciprocity in the sense defined in the contract model, which creates obstacles for claims of justice. It must be noted that in high-tech reproduction, as is the case with gestational surrogacy, the unified process of birthing and parenting becomes highly fragmented. There can be an egg donor, the surrogate, and the social parent, who may or may not be the genetic parent. However, such disaggregation of parenting also leads to differential value of the parties involved. The social parent is valued the most since her role is seen as the ultimate goal of the whole process. Then we have the genetic parent, that is the egg donor. And actually in the Hypatia paper on race, I have spoken quite a bit about how egg donors often are chosen keeping race, caste, etc. in mind, right? And last of all in that hierarchy comes the surrogate. Now, undoubtedly, all three categories of women involved have to go through emotional and physical suffering. There is tremendous stigma, for instance, that may be attached to infertility, as is the case in the Indian context. Again, there is social stigma in acting as a surrogate. However, not only does the emotional and physical pain that a surrogate goes through get somewhere diluted, but she is usually given the least importance in the entire process in terms of social status, decision-making, and power. She remains in the most devalued and disposable position. Her precarity and dehumanization is compounded when she's further vilified for her decision to give up the child after birthing. That is, when her legitimacy as a moral subject is questioned on these grounds. Fundamental asymmetries and inequalities are ingrained in the surrogacy relation, which distributes vulnerability unequally in the surrogacy contract. And this is the point that reproductive liberalism misses. If we are to use the language of benefits and burdens in the surrogacy contract, then clearly there is a distributive injustice where there is disproportionate burdens and vulnerabilities on the side of the birth giver as compared to the social parent, which makes it difficult to ground moral entitlements in the liberal language of equality-based reciprocity. So in these sort of considerations, given these sort of considerations, the liberal concepts of choice, autonomy, and reciprocity appear to be inadequate for analyzing vulnerabilities of birth givers in third-party reproduction and for grounding any claim to reciprocity in a meaningful
I have a coffee now. Thank you, darling.
Sorry, Amrita, I think that was an accident by someone.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so with this now I move to the second section where I have pointed out, but I'll talk about another alternative that is then given to reproductive liberalism, which is the exploitation model. And I will also talk about certain shortcomings of this model, although it may be an improvement on liberalism in certain aspects, but it still falls short. To counter reproductive liberalism, a different Western ethical paradigm was traditionally proposed. This framework argues against surrogacy on the grounds of exploitation of the surrogate. The exploitation argument took many forms and was frequently connected to the commodification argument. It is argued by this camp of ethicists that surrogacy, instead of making the feminist project a reality by giving women control over their bodies, in fact serves the opposite purpose. It ends up reducing women to their wombs and defining them in terms of their reproductive capacities. Based on this aspect of commodification, the exploitation model argues that the surrogate is exploited because her labor and her body are judged on the basis of their use value. They also highlight that choice does not arise in a socio-cultural vacuum. What appears to be a choice of the individual surrogate is often the outcome of explicit or tacit coercion. So what appears as choice is actually coercion. There is no choice in this context. And some radical feminist thinkers have also argued along these lines. Although the available paradigm of exploitation and coercion can perhaps better accommodate some of the justice-related considerations, including vulnerabilities and the lack of material reciprocity between the surrogate and her client, I argue that an ethical approach to transnational surrogacy based purely on these concepts seems to create new problems for itself. The language of use and control at the heart of this paradigm can end up projecting individuals purely as passive victims who are always at the mercy of superior forces outside of them. The exploitation framework, simplistically taking, I believe, is vitiated by the opposite problem. They only focus on the object status of an individual, right? Whereas the reproductive liberalism was focusing on the subject status. So they've mainly, the exploitation model is focusing on the object status and denying any authenticity to the surrogate's act of taking up an identity as a birth giver. This language becomes particularly worrisome when used in the context of transnational surrogacy, since it can lead to the reinforcement of stereotypes of third world women being inherently powerless and passive victims. In my recent work on the transnational intervention into an ethics of care, I think I've shared that article. I have further expanded on the dangers of a turn away from reciprocity by only emphasizing exploitation and vulnerability in transnational ethics. Now, my analysis takes inspiration from some important hegemonic critiques of hegemonic Western feminisms by transnational feminists. Often the understanding of women from developing nations on the part of a number of Western feminists is mediated by what Chandra Mohanty calls third world difference, which can only be grasped in view of the domination of the world system by the West. Since third world women are perceived through third world difference, they are treated as immature and as lacking agency. Incidentally, such distorted perceptions and subsequent homogenization on the basis of these stereotypes is responsible for the creation of categories like the third world woman. According to Mohanty, this category is truly speaking a discursive category brought into existence within certain hegemonic constraints and often in order to serve colonialist agendas. And Mohanty points out how in this framing, it is very difficult for third world women to rise above the debilitating generality of their object status. And as opposed to them, the first world woman is defined as a powerful subject. And this then becomes the ground for speaking for them, dismissing their voices as inauthentic and so on. And I have emphasized in my work on race and surrogacy how this idea of third world difference functions hand in hand with the idea of first world privilege. First world privilege intersects with prevailing localized hierarchies of race, class, and caste to give new life to various structural inequalities across the first third world divide, and justifies the unequal distribution of benefits and burdens in transnational contexts, including when it comes to the work of birthing. In the light of the fact that ideological renderings of third world women deprive them of agency and turn them into passive victims, focusing merely on the passivity and victim status of third world surrogates can have negative repercussions for social justice and can tacitly strengthen colonialist agendas. The actual narratives of agency on the part of third world surrogates remain much more complex than either reproductive liberalism or the exploitation model allows for. Therefore, the need is for a philosophical paradigm that is able to ground claims of moral entitlement and highlight concerns around justice in transnational surrogacy without taking either of the two extremes. That is either assuming equality-based reciprocity in the surrogacy contract or simply focusing on exploitation and vulnerabilities of the surrogate. The other thing I just want to quickly point out is that although these two models are given as a counter to each other, I think the two models actually share some common misunderstandings. And the first of these is that each of these models focuses on, for the most part, confines its attention to either the active or the passive dimension of human existence. Reproductive liberalism emphasizes autonomy and choice, while exploitation model emphasizes vulnerability and exploitation. However, agency and passivity often do not constitute a dichotomy within our lived experience. And this is a point I will try to sort of develop on in the context of the pragmatist model. We realize this further when we begin to listen to the voices of surrogates. And therefore, I think the philosophical point I want to make is that it is hasty to draw any simple correlation between activity and being powerful on the one hand, and between passivity and being a victim or powerless on the other. So we have to be careful about, unleashing a host of other binaries through these. Second, even while differing widely in their analysis and goals, both models seem to share a certain misunderstanding of the idea of power. Both seem to work under a kind of powerful powerless dichotomy, which I think is the result of a power over scheme of analysis, to use Mary Parker Follett's term. And she's one of the pragmatists who I find very important to talk about as I develop this model. She's an early 20th century philosopher. Now, the dominant stance, both these models take a very sort of thin understanding of power, where they mainly understand power in terms of domination, nothing else, domination and control. And once power is simply understood as domination, it means that one either has power or does not have it. So it gives rise to this powerful, powerless dichotomy. And this actually then misses a lot of aspects of what oppression is, as well as what empowerment is. And so I think a thicker notion of empowerment is required for a feminist ethical perspective on transnational surrogacy that none of these models are actually able to provide. With this, I now move into the concluding section of the paper, which focuses on the feminist pragmatist framework. In light of the critique of the dominant ethical models, I have developed a philosophical framework for conceptualizing agency and empowerment while factoring in exploitation for the purpose of a richer ethical analysis. I call this framework the feminist pragmatist model, since aspects of it are also inspired by the philosophical tradition of pragmatism, especially the work of Follett on power. And in the rest of this section, I will lay out some of the important features of this model. Now, the first feature that I want to sort of highlight is that the feminist pragmatist model recommends a move away from an ontology of entities towards an ontology of relations as a way of understanding both identity and agency of surrogates in the context of the practice. An ontology of relations makes relation, let's say the relation between X and Y, rather than the individual X and Y, the starting point of analysis. Any fruitful conceptualization of the related entities X and Y is possible only when we look into the ways in which they interact and emerge as entities in the context of the relation. So this is a relation first approach as opposed to an individual first approach when it comes to thinking about moral relations. An individual entity must be understood as an interweaving of activities in a process rather than as a fixed static unit. And I believe that if we restructure moral ontology along this line, then we will be able to frame the understanding of surrogacy itself in a very different way. When we apply this this model to transnational surrogacy, for instance, we can approach the identity and lived experience of agency for the surrogate and her first world client by foregrounding the relation of surrogacy. So we don't begin as from the notion of a first world client or a third world surrogate, but we begin from the point of view of the relation. A primary reason for the failure of the dominant approaches, I think, is an excessive reliance on an ontology of entities rather than one of relations. For instance, reproductive liberalism seems to be obsessed with a rather non-relational notion of individuality. When it focuses on individual choice and autonomy, that prevents it from addressing or altering the social context in which the individual is located. The exploitation paradigm, despite being a little more advanced in this respect, it, however, in its prohibition form, makes claims about severing the surrogacy relationship altogether as that adequate ethical response without taking the actual realities of the situation into account. Moreover, even if we say that the exploitation paradigm is better than the liberal paradigm, insofar as it takes a relational approach because it focuses on the constraints of choice, I worry that its primary focus on passivity and victimization does not really generate a rich account of agency, which I have already discussed in the previous section. The strength of an ontology of relations, in contrast, lies in the fact that it is able to capture the complexities in our experience of power in everyday life. An act of choice must be attributed a certain degree of authenticity by virtue of the fact that we actively transform a situation through our choice. Yet, we cannot make a claim to empowerment simply on the grounds of exercising choice. Right? So we need to give choice an authenticity, but we also need to understand that choice is not equal to, or decisional autonomy is not equal to empowerment. There is a complex interplay of freedom and unfreedom in any act of choosing because of our existence as relational individuals and not particularistic ones. And that is what the ontology of relations brings into the picture as opposed to the ontology of entities. In fact, often a close look at our experiences as relational individuals reveals a rather complex phenomenology of empowerment and disempowerment arising within these relations. In the evaluation of our experiences, this subtlety cannot be left out of the account. The second feature, which is very important, is as follows. While unearthing a complexity in the phenomenological experience of power, Follett notes that all these experiences do not necessarily signify empowerment. In fact, she gives us a way of making qualitative distinctions between different kinds of power. For her, power in general denotes a kind of agency, the ability to act. One can try to exercise one's agency by exerting power over through domination, for instance. Although this can appear to be empowering, it cannot be genuine empowerment on Follett's schemes. She therefore actually talks about a different kind of power, which she calls power with, as opposed to power over, or power only in the sense of domination. So she draws a subtle distinction between control and power and points out that although control might sometimes exist in a situation of empowerment, it is not the sole indicator of empowerment. Since we are not particularistic individuals and only come to be an individual in the context of a relation, our individuality depends on preserving healthy relations and nurturing them in a certain manner. In this scenario, building productive relations and not severing them is the best way of preserving a healthy individual. Therefore, power with becomes a genuine indicator of empowerment for Follett. Now, of course, I don't have time to go in detail into this theory, but when we bring the analysis back to transnational surrogacy, some of these insights can actually help us to discern subtleties in the transnational surrogate's identity and experience of power, as well as that of her first world client. One of the things that instantly stand out is the asymmetry in economic resources between the two. The interesting point to note, however, is that often the commissioning clients are middle class in their own country and come to India or other developing nations for ARTs because they cannot afford similar services in their own countries. We now start to see that the power of a commissioning client as a first world individual is actualized only by virtue of the relationship with the transnational surrogate. So it's not that they come into the relation, but how they become the first world client is also partly structured by the relation itself. In the context of this relationship, she gains the power to exercise real consumer choice, a term evoked by Helena Ragon. The power that such a consumer choice guarantees becomes evident when we look at examples of special requests that are made by foreign couples at various clinics. The point to note is that technology from the first world becomes available to these clients from the first world only when they travel to the third world in the context of reproductive tourism, and by virtue of the presence of the third world surrogate. Therefore, any power that the first world client enjoys through consumer choice and her emergence as the powerful first world individual is facilitated and dependent on the existence of the third world surrogate. Surrogacy seems to restructure the surrogate's own situation and her experience of power in crucial ways too. An important feature of the Indian context is that a significant number of surrogates come from groups that are disadvantaged in terms of class, caste, education, etc., and sometimes a combination of these factors. It is also true, as Laura Purdy points out, that poor women are more often confined to low-level jobs in unsafe environments and suffer exposure to toxic chemicals and dangerous machinery. And in Rudrappa's work, ethnographic work in the Indian context, also she gives examples of women who chose surrogacy over other work where they were routinely facing sexual harassment in the workplace, for instance. So not surprising then that surrogacy becomes a less exploitative option to them. And this reality must be acknowledged as we theorize the ethics of the practice, right? Economically disadvantaged women will still keep on turning to these moral or at least equally risky and exploitative occupations if the realities of their social location remain unchanged. Under the circumstances, the payment for being a surrogate seems to be an important draw. Various reports and interviews seem to suggest that surrogacy helps these women to acquire resources and consequently play an active role in family and decision-making as never before. So their experience of their private worlds in turn can be restructured to a certain extent when they begin to have a voice in matters of family and children, right? So again, the power they exercise becomes very relational, right? So not just the identity is relational, but how we understand the power or lack of power actually can only be understood through the surrogacy relation in this context. Now, so what I want to emphasize is that different capacities of the same work and how one experiences or whether one experiences empowerment or disempowerment through it is going to change with the change in context. What appears to be empowering in the context of surrogacy might not be the same when the surrogate is engaged in birth work in her own community. So sometimes there have been cases where the surrogates comes into the formal medical system only when she is taking up work as surrogacy, and when she has had her own children, she did not get the kind of maternal care that she gets when she's actually doing the birth work as a surrogate. So, so this again seems to highlight that some trace of agency and power within the situation is there in the context of this relation of interdependency. In the context of our more recent work, actually a paper co-authored with Priya Sharma, which is forthcoming in Hypatia, we have also argued that another way of grasping the agency of surrogates is as epistemic and moral agents. So when they do the kind of birth work that they do in the context of desegregation of motherhood, they actually generate new rationalities and new sorts of affects that one doesn't find in the context of traditional birth work. So this is again a space, a potential space from where we can theorize her agency. A couple of more points coming back to the model. The third point, however, is that although a patient hearing of the voices on both sides exposes some traces of agency in the situation of transnational surrogacy, this is not enough to read the relation as empowerment, especially for the third world surrogate. Right, so we are also trying to make a distinction between agency and empowerment here in terms of a philosophical idea. The little amount of power with that the surrogate appears to exercise is present among vast contexts of asymmetric power relations. In other words, a power over situation. So therefore, and there are many instances in which the surrogate, while she experiences empowerment through the capacity of giving birth. However, at the same time, there are many aspects of dehumanization when it comes to, for instance, she has to institute a maternal fetal conflict at every moment of her pregnancy, because she knows that she has to give up the child that she's birthed. So therefore, how the rationality and affect and the birth work is carried out gets drastically restructured. So all these things, often they have to live away from their families in hostels, in the surrogate clinics, or attached to the surrogacy clinics, because they don't want to, they would be considered as doing dirty work if they're doing this in their villages. So that means that they might have to stay away from their own children. So there are a lot of these aspects that come into the picture. So even as we think about agency, we cannot really treat this as a situation of empowerment. And also, in fact, in the paper on race and surrogacy, I have argued how the stereotypes such as poor third world women of color also get reinforced in the context of the relation. So there's reference to an interview with a person who, a white client who had availed of surrogacy, and she states in a way that she wanted the surrogate mother to be attached to the babies. But this was only because she already had the awareness, as the next quote in the interview reveals, that, and I quote, "It would not have been in the Indian surrogate's interest to keep the babies because she could not afford to. And in any case, they were going to be white kids and it would have looked a bit funny," unquote. This remark, among other things, exposes an awareness of the racial difference and the difference with the surrogate. And in fact, the sort of some assumption about the exclusive character of racial difference, whereby the surrogate's own blood or own bodily material that she is giving to the child is actually not figured into the understanding of the race of the child. So the race of the child is purely determined in terms of the egg, but not the work of gestation that the surrogate carries out. So through a framework called racialized gender analysis in that paper, I have discussed how the category of women of color gets reconfigured as surrogacy, as race travels through across national borders through transnational surrogacy. And I have argued that racial distancing may in turn result in a kind of ethical distancing, whereby you perceive a lower degree of responsibility to the racialized other than to people of one's own race. And I have also discussed how racial borders get policed even within the surrogate's body when a surrogate gestates, and how a micro level eugenics may get enacted in the context of surrogacy. In any case, another interesting point to keep in mind, and this is the last point I want to make, is that the choice of third world women to take up the identity of a transnational surrogate and benefit from the limited opportunities it brings is made possible only by virtue of her being located in a disadvantageous position in the global economy to begin with. right? So the larger context of power over, in which a very limited power width seems to have a place, gradually becomes exposed as we take a closer look at the relation. So factors like alienation, trauma, and so on in the surrogate's experience come to be the signifiers of a problem, one that dangerously threatens to undermine and destabilize the little power width that she has in the relation. So much more work is needed to convert the situation to one of empowerment, understood in the sense of power width. So one of the main points that I want to emphasize today as a takeaway from this analysis is that a feminist pragmatist lens to transnational surrogacy helps us to gain an awareness of the ways in which not only our identity is relational, but power or the lack of it also arises in the context of relations. It also helps us to understand the fact that the experience of empowerment and disempowerment must not necessarily be construed as a dichotomy. It is still possible to be a victim while actively making a choice, or at least appearing to do so. And this serves an important function in the surrogacy debate because we have a way of acknowledging the agency of the surrogate in actively taking up that identity in extremely difficult circumstances without reducing her to a passive being. At the same time, it is also possible to understand how she's still exploited in a sense in which her client is not, and how it would be problematic to characterize her situation as one of empowerment. And so therefore, so what is important therefore at the end of the day is to address the issue of exploitation in a much more meaningful way, whereby the concept of exploitation itself is thought in association with concepts of agency and empowerment, right? That these are not seen to be opposite, that you have, if you don't have agency, you're exploited, and if you are exploited, you cannot have agency, right? So this dichotomy needs to be avoided, and only if we are able to situate the surrogates as understand the subjectivity of the surrogates, that in the sense that they are exploited but yet are agents, and they may be victims but are nevertheless engaged in a resistance to the conditions of their oppression. And this is really needed in order to ground an ethics of caregiving which humanizes the birth giver and respects the work of birthing that she does. So with that, I would conclude my talk. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Amrita, for this amazing and super clear and systematic lecture. Very, very strong and interesting argument. So thank you so much. We have time for 2 questions. So please, maybe Amrita, you can stop sharing your PowerPoint and then we can see everyone. Yeah, perfect.
Yes.
Dann bin ich natürlich sehr gespannt, of course. Das kann ich wieder wegpacken.
Somebody's. So is there anyone who has a question about this amazing lecture for Amrita? Otherwise, I will start again. Yes, no one else?
There's a question in the chat, I think.
Yeah, if you could share some of the authors who write about feminist pragmatist model. So maybe this is something you could share to us and then we can upload it later.
So the thing is that with the feminist pragmatist model that I outlined, that is what I am developing in the context of maternity work. So I've shared an article called Reorienting the Ethics of Surrogacy. There I talked about, I developed the feminist pragmatist model. So that would be the primary source for it. And in the references to that paper, you'll actually find references to Follett's work. She does not really, she is not a feminist philosopher, neither is she talking about any of any of these issues, but she has a very interesting theory of power. and actually much before Foucault, if I might add. So she's one of the really sort of interesting early 20th century women philosophers, very fascinating understanding of power, aspects of which I have found very helpful in developing the feminist pragmatist model. But when it comes to the model, that paper of mine would be the resource to look at.